A few weeks ago, I decided to take a long hike in a very dense forest near my city. I lived in a small town with less than 1,000 people, and we were far from any big place. The forest had no mountains or hills, but it was full of lakes and a few streams. My destination was one of these streams. I had been there before, but never camped. I knew it was a long way, about 3 hours walking straight north. As I walked through the trees, the environment was very quiet. I could only hear the birds and some animals rustling in the leaves. There were no other people and no trails. I didn't expect to see anyone, but about 45 minutes from the river, I crossed paths with a man. We both got closer to each other without realizing it, until we were a few meters away, separated by some trees. We were a little confused, until the man gave me a nervous smile, turned around, and walked away quickly. I thought it was all very strange, but I continued on my way. I reached the river and set up my tent in the flattest spot I could find. I lit a fire as the sun was almost setting. I was eager to see the stars away from the city lights. I wanted to see the Milky Way, something I loved to observe. After a few hours, while I was waiting for the stars to appear, I heard a strange sound coming from the forest behind me. Footsteps, slow and careful. I turned quickly but saw nothing. I took out my flashlight and began to shine it around, but there was no one in sight. My heart began to beat faster, and that feeling of being watched returned. I asked out loud, "Is anyone there?" but got no answer. I decided to follow the sound and began to walk slowly, with the flashlight illuminating every corner. When I got close to where the noise seemed to be coming from, I moved the light and suddenly there he was, the same man from before, standing about 20 feet away from me. Even with the flashlight pointed at him, the man did not move. Trying not to show panic, I continued to move the light as if I had not seen him. I walked back to camp, acting as naturally as possible. I quickly grabbed my things and, without looking back, walked through the forest towards a river. When I felt I was far enough away, I ran as fast as I could until I felt safe. I stopped to rest and stayed awake until the sun came up. I never saw that man again, but I also never went back to get my tent, afraid of what I might find. A few days ago, I took my RV to a forest a few miles from my house. I live in a rural area with lots of trees and forests, so camping is a common occurrence here. The place I went to wasn't very well known, but it had enough space for a couple of RVs. I like it there because there's hardly anyone there and the path is wide, which makes it easy to move the RV. When I arrived, the grassy field was completely empty, just the way I like it. I took my time, parking my RV and getting ready. I set up a tent outside and put my chair out to relax. It was still daylight, but I decided to gather some wood to start a fire later. So I went into the woods behind the RV, a little far away, so much so that I lost sight of the campsite. The wood was still a little wet from a recent rain, so it took me a while to find enough dry pieces. After about 20 minutes, I went back to the RV. When I got there, I noticed a man setting up a tent not far away. He waved at me, and I waved back a little embarrassed. I found it a bit annoying to have to share the space, since I expected to be alone. I grabbed the wood I had gathered and threw it on the ground, then went to the trailer to get a drink and hang out inside for a while, with the sunroof open. I stayed there for about 30 minutes, maybe more, before I decided to take a look out the window. When I looked to the side, I saw that the man had finished setting up his tent, but something caught my attention. The tent was in terrible shape, full of holes and cuts, with pieces of fabric flapping in the wind. It looked like a very old tent, almost useless. I wondered how he could think it would be good for sleeping. Besides, I couldn't see the man inside the tent or anywhere else nearby. I got out of the trailer and started building a fire. As the fire grew, the sun was already setting and darkness was taking over the forest. I kept looking at the tent without a sign of the man. Time passed, and the fact that he hadn't returned began to bother me. I looked at my watch, and it was almost 1 a.m. It had been dark for hours, and the man still hadn't shown up. So I decided to approach the tent to see if he was there. "Are you there?" I called out, but there was no answer. I stood in the middle of the camp looking around. Maybe he had gotten lost in the woods? As I tried to figure out what was happening, something moved among the trees. I stood still, trying to get a better look. Little by little, my eyes began to focus, and then I saw it. There was someone standing, leaning against a tree, trying to hide. A wave of fear washed over me. The more I looked, the harder it was to believe that this person was the man from the tent. I took a few steps back, my heart racing, and then I ran to the trailer. I looked out the window, and the person was still there, standing, looking in my direction. Without thinking much, I ran to the trailer's cabin, started the engine, and got out of there as fast as I could. To this day, what scares me the most is thinking, was that the same man I saw before, or someone else? If it was someone else, what did he do to the man in the tent? Maybe they were together, and the other one was watching me from somewhere in the forest, without me noticing. 2 years ago, I was living with my younger brother on the East Coast. We didn't do much interesting things together, except for the occasional meal with friends. One day, I decided I needed a change and started looking for new activities. The most common suggestion I found was camping, since we lived near the Appalachian Mountains. I told my brother about the idea, but he wasn't too keen. Still, after a few days, I went to the store and bought a small tent and some safety gear. I packed my old backpack and prepared to spend a night alone on the trail. I knew that camping alone wasn't a great idea, since I was completely inexperienced, but I figured that since it was only one night, I wouldn't have any problems. After an hour of driving, I arrived at the trailhead. There were no other cars, and it felt like I was completely alone. I grabbed my backpack and started hiking. The trail was narrow and looked unkempt, with lots of bushes growing in the way. After a while, it became difficult to tell where the trail began and ended, but I kept walking. After an hour of walking, I reached the end of the trail. The place was small and covered in vegetation, just as I had expected. But something immediately caught my attention. There was a pile of burnt logs, as if someone had recently built a fire, maybe even the night before. I looked around, but there was no sign of a tent or anyone else there. I decided not to worry too much about it and went to the other side of the camp, where I put my things on the ground and started setting up my tent. I took my time getting everything right. When I was done, there was still some sunlight, so I took the opportunity to eat something inside my sleeping bag. That's when suddenly, I heard a sound that sounded like a fire being lit. I unzipped the tent and, to my surprise, saw a man sitting on the other side of the camp, near the burnt logs. He looked to be much older than me, maybe 40 years old. The little sunlight that remained filtered through the trees, and all I could see was him looking at me. Nervously, I raised my hand and waved at him. After a few seconds, he waved back, without saying anything. I went back to my side, grabbed some twigs, and lit my own fire. The sky grew darker, and soon there was only the light from our fires. The man continued to sit there motionless. I looked up from time to time, trying to see if he had a tent, a backpack, or anything, but there was nothing. It was strange. The trail was the only way to get there, and I was sure I hadn't heard him coming. If he had come from the other side, he would have come from a completely empty forest. Time passed slowly, and the man simply continued to sit there, staring straight ahead. I couldn't understand what was happening. I decided I must be overreacting and went into my tent to try to sleep. I lay there, listening to the faint sound of the man's fire. I was restless, my mind racing, but I tried to relax. After a while, I heard something. The sound of leaves being stepped on, coming towards my tent. My heart started racing. I sat up and listened carefully until I saw the shadow of the man on the other side of the tent fabric. He stood there, still without saying anything. My body froze as I watched him, not knowing what to do. After a few seconds, the shadow began to move away, and the sound of footsteps disappeared. I quickly unzipped the tent and looked outside. The man was gone. The camp was empty, and only the burning logs remained. Without thinking twice, I began to dismantle everything in a hurry. pushing the tent and even breaking some supports in my desperation to get out of there as quickly as possible. I left there and never saw the man again. To this day, I have no idea what was happening that night or what might have happened if I had stayed.